Equity in education. Economic factors in education. Education is a critical factor in economic performance. Research suggests that education is an investment that increases skills, productivity, and economic rewards. These rewards can be divided into two separate elements: private returns and positive externalities, or social returns. Literature suggests that while there are some positive externalities of higher education, private individuals have significantly higher returns. As the private individual reaps more rewards from higher education than society does, the question of who pays for tertiary education comes into focus. Barr discusses these ideas in depth. Firstly, he recognizes two varying economic models involved in the nature of higher education. The Anglo-American model argues for diverse education, with quality and provision varying within each institution, and the Scandinavian model, which views institution as homogeneous and equal. Interestingly, we can link these two models with the welfare state ideology. The Anglo-American model resonating with neoliberalist individualist policy, while the Scandinavian model links with social democratic policy. Using these two models of the welfare state ideas, we can understand the varying concepts around who should pay for higher education fees. Chapman argues that due to the high private benefits of tertiary education, governments should ensure that investment in education should be relevant to societal benefits. As a result, both Barr and Chapman argued that higher education should be subsidized by the government, but mainly covered by individuals. What is HECS? The Australian government introduced the Higher Education Contribution Scheme, HECS, in 1989. HECS is one form of microeconomic policy developed to introduce private payments to the higher education instead of government-funded tuition. Furthermore, the introduction of HECS was due to several economic factors, such as a rise in school retention and the 1980s being a time of fiscal parsimony, which resulted in changing economic views on public expenditure. The first goal of HECS was to increase private contributions to tertiary education through the introduction of student fees, which also reduced the government expenditure in the education sector. The second aim was to maintain the idea that all Australians, regardless of socioeconomic status, could access tertiary education. Under the HECS Act, students had the ability to pay for their own education either upfront or defer it. If the payment is deferred, the Australian Taxation Office regulates the payments, making the loan income contingent. Barr and Chapman argued that income contingent education loans are the most efficient and equitable loans as students repay them based on their income, which means there is no possibility of students being unable to pay the loan or repaying through hardships. The HECS policy is one example of a shift towards neoliberalism, as deregulation and individualistic responsibilities are two of its main characteristics. Advantages of HECS. There have been many positive advantages to the HECS income contingent loan. Two of these significant advantages will be discussed. First, HECS has become an essential part of education revenue, further investing in education and allowing an increase in education spending elsewhere. Second, Gregory describes how the shift in government-funded education to private allowed more money in the government's budget to be shifted to areas in greater need. While these two positive effects of HECS may seem small, they allow for government investment in education to reflect the level of positive externalities received by Australian society. Disadvantages of HECS. There have been several disadvantages of HECS marked by researchers, mainly focusing on the equitability of the policy. Gregory states that HECS obligations are based on advantaged groups in terms of academic and social ability and economics. However, HECS has been noted to reduce the ability of disadvantaged people to apply for tertiary education. Birch and Miller highlighted that students from high socioeconomic backgrounds are more likely to pay their HECS debt upfront. In comparison, Marx remarked that students with lower socioeconomic backgrounds may have significant trouble paying for the debt back and are less likely to pay upfront. Similarly, Birch and Miller continued to say that low to medium socioeconomic status students may have their HECS debt affecting their decision-making on various issues, such as home purchasing and employment opportunities. Overall, there are both advantages and disadvantages to HECS policy.
HECS is not the only economic policy that has been proposed in an effort to make education more equitable. Another approach is by implementing a universal basic income. The idea of a universal basic income, or UBI, is not a new idea. and has existed in many forms throughout history as something that's considered utopian. It is in itself a very simple. The government provides a periodic cash payment that is substantial enough to live on for every person in society. The only condition required to receive this payout is that you have a pulse. There's no paperwork, no income tests, and no receipts. The UBI approaches equity in the way that it advocates that it is a basic human right that every person has the right to live comfortably and with dignity. While the idea in itself is simple, it's taken many forms and has been endorsed by many visible figures in history, such as Thomas Paine, Martin Luther King Jr., and Richard Nixon. It is seen as a way to reduce inequality, inequity, and gradually eliminate poverty. This is because it concentrates on everyone and everyone receiving an equal payment, so no one's slipping through the cracks. This idea, when applied to a tertiary education, presents a different way to achieve a more equitable system. This is because UBI focuses on reducing a scarcity mindset. The scarcity mindset can be defined as a mental shift due to the perception of scarce resources. When we perceive something as scarce, we act differently, as our focus is narrowed to what we immediately lack. This also means that a long-term planning is impeded, as our problems before us can be all-consuming. It has been shown time and time again that people in low socioeconomic areas are more likely to commit crimes, have health problems, save less, and exercise less. Utopia for Realists author Rutger Bregman has said frequently that people in poverty make poor decisions because of this scarcity mentality, and that it is the fault of the system for not providing support in those times. It's not the fault of the individual. However, Margaret Thatcher is one of those people that has said that poverty is a personality defect. Although this is a very extreme and inaccurate view, her point hinges on the idea that people who are struggling to meet their basic needs have less mental bandwidth to focus on planning their education in the future or planning something long-term, as all of their focus is on making good short-term decisions, making ends meet, and having enough food on the table, something that people don't have to worry about when they have enough money and enough to get by. So reducing the scarcity mindset would really help in those low socioeconomic areas for people to actually have the capacity to focus on education without being taken down by the everydayness of life. It is in this lens of understanding of human behaviour that a UBI approaches economic policy. From an economic perspective, the best way to ensure that education is equitable is to focus on ensuring that everyone can afford their basic necessities comfortably, so that no one is functioning on a scarcity mindset. When comparing the two theoretical concepts of UBI to the Australian welfare system and HECS debt, we see some contrasting differences. On the welfare system, time is taken up by students from low socioeconomic backgrounds, as they have to jump through hoops to gain financial help and prove their eligibility over and over again. Something that people from high socioeconomic areas that are funded by their parents don't have to do. A UBI would be accessible to everyone, regardless of status, and that would take away a lot of the paperwork and a lot of the stress around university work, how we're going to pay our rent. We also find that HECS, it does take away the barrier at the entry for university. However, the UBI would take away that scarcity mindset during university. So while a student is not living with debt with HECS, they would also be living with the basics and knowing that they could afford the next meal with a UBI. A UBI would also open up alternate pathways for innovation, as while university does offer a very structured and recognised pathway, a UBI would also encourage people to pursue non-traditional forms of education that are still very valuable. When we partner the ideas of a UBI and HECS debt, we see a new economic idea. In Denmark, tuition is free and a generous guaranteed income is provided to students that are studying full-time that are also citizens. This system combines the two driving ideas behind the UBI and HECS debt. alleviating costs at the point of entry, and allowing students, regardless of background, to be able to live a financially comfortable life. According to the OECD, Denmark has one of the highest graduation rates of students, and graduates often graduate virtually debt-free. Combining the UBI and HEX model is more consistent with the Scandinavian economic model of education and is of social democratic policy in favouring equity above efficiency. Variations of the combined model have led to some of the best education outcomes in the world today, as we've seen some of the safest countries with high OECD on the Better Life Index. As we can see on this graph here, the highlighted countries do provide free tertiary education and grants to students while they study. And a lot of them are using, well, all of the ones highlighted are using that Scandinavian model of applying equity. This combined model demonstrates the spillover benefits of taking away barriers to higher education and how by focusing holistically on a student, we can improve the equity of the education system and educational outcomes. Thank you.